Hey, Embroidery Legacy family, this is Auntie Christine with another helpful hint for everybody that wants to ask those burning questions about embroidery, but you're too afraid to ask. We're going to talk about tatami stitch today. Tatami stitch is a fill stitch that we all use, but how much do we really know about where it came from and what it is? So today I got my hard hat on, got my bricks, got my safety vest, and we're ready to go. So let's talk a little bit about how tatami works and where it's from. So you're asking, what's the advantage to tatami stitch over satin stitch? Satin's so beautiful and shiny. Tatami is also shiny. It's not quite as shiny, but it's much more sturdy and you can fill larger areas with it. Anything that's a large area wants to be done in tatami because the stitches, since they're shorter, they don't snag on clothing if you rub against a wall. Satin stitches, the most you can do is 7 millimeters on a piece of clothing and 10 millimeters, which is the normal threshold for the machine. Tatami stitch you can make a lot smaller. You can also make it larger to make your area seem more satiny. So there's some pluses and minuses with tatami. It's great for a fill, but what do we do when we have a line? Oh, wait a minute, what about these little spaces right here? So when we look at the side of a building, let's say that's the side of a building or the edge. You have a large one, but now I have half pieces here. I have to have something to fill in so that this is straight. And that if this is the edge of your tatami stitching, these little tiny stitches can really add a lot of bulk and add a lot of stitch count in your design. They also can cause the edges to be a little bit rough. So what happens when the machine stitches? It's going to go stitch, stitch, stitch. It's going to stop. It's going to go, oh, wait a minute, I got to go back this way. So it's going to do a couple stitches, then it starts back on this. If you go over and you have a tiny little stitch at the end, it's going to go stitch, stitch, and then it's going to stitch again to turn around. It's kind of like a swimmer in a swim meet having to turn around and go the other way. It takes a little effort. So we're trying to not have as many of these little stitches. That's why we don't want a line of tatami. A line of tatami might look like this. So we only have actually a few large stitches and everything else is small. So what do? We get a little crunchy, wadded up line. It doesn't look beautiful. For lines, we want to use satin or we want to use running stitch so that they're nice and soft and supple. So let's build a tatami wall and see why this works the way it does. We want to do a little bit of a close-up. These are my awesome tatami slippers. In Japan, mats are used in houses everywhere because it's a cleanliness issue. People do not ever wear shoes in Japanese houses. They wear slippers or they will wear little socks. It's a matter of respect and it just keeps everything clean. The awesome part about tatami mats is they allow dirt to go in between and under so they can pick up the mat and clean them out. These tatami slippers have a little bit different design than you're used to. These are long columns, but this is indeed a type of tatami weave. It can either be thin bamboo or it can be different kinds of grass. But the point is you want it to be woven and you want it to be solid. So let's look at what tatami looks like kind of in a really, really expanded version. We're going to talk about bricks today, but this is my tatami stitch. It is a stitch and a little skip, a stitch and a little skip, and a stitch. Then it turns around and it goes back, a stitch, a little skip, a stitch, just like a brick wall. And then we start with the original. So these are offset. It's just a brick pattern, and it presents a lot of really good things, but it also has some limitations. So let's look at what a complete square might look like in tatami, really, really expanded. So it's a stitch, a stitch, a stitch. Uh-oh, we got to fill in this little empty space right here. So we fill it in with a half block. Then a stitch and a half block, which fills in the empty space. Then we have 3 full, half block, full block, half block. Tatami makes its patterns by alternating how long these blocks are and how long the offset is. So when you in hatch embroidery and in many other kinds of embroidery, when you use tatami and you make a shape, it allows you to create different patterns by offsetting these bricks. But for right now, we're going to talk about a 45-degree angle, and it's just offsetting the bricks this way. The problem that we run into with tatami in thin lines and cutting out holes is, what do we do with these little guys here? If this is a 2.5 millimeter stitch, this is tiny, 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 and you're asking the machine to stitch here, and now I got to do a couple stitches so I can start back to go the other direction. It's going to create a lot of stitches for you. So the main point of today is to try to help you understand how this is put together and why we don't use it for thin lines and why we don't like to cut little tiny holes out of tatami. Because if I cut, let's say I cut these 3 out here, or I cut a little bit of this, you can create small bricks, and it just creates a lot of stitches around your holes. So we're gonna go on and look at how to build a wall. Okay, so I guess you all know that tatami does not have to just be used in a square. So what happens if we have something that's not a square? Let's cut off a little bit of this. Now, my tatami looks like this. Wow, that is a huge problem. This one right here, those stitches are all going to be right on top of each other. So you may have 1, 2, 3, 4, or more stitches right on top of it, and it makes a little knot. They're uncomfortable. They're bulletproof. They're not really great. So if you have a line, let's go even farther. If you have a line made out of tatami, in this line, I only have 3 actually almost full-length stitches. Everything else are these partial stitches. When I get that done, that's going to be crunchy and full of knots and stitches. So we don't want to use tatami on a thin line. Likewise, if you cut out of the center of the tatami, it's going to create these tiny little stitches, half blocks, third blocks, and even less. So we want to avoid that, but let's look a little bit about how we put this wall together. I know these cicadas are bothering me. I hope they're not bothering you, but we're going to keep on with our building our wall. So we've got some kind of crazy pieces, we got little pieces, we got full bricks here. Let's build a little something. I'm going to start with that. I'm going to start with this. There's a little space in between. And then I'm going to put my next stitch. Okay, how do we fill out this and this? We're going to put 2 tiny stitches there. Okay, now the sides are nice and even. When it comes back for the next row, there's my 2 stitches. Okay, next row, same thing. I've got these little pieces here that I've got to get in. Okay, for very small things, this looks really big, but let's say that this is very, very small. It's going to stitch from here to here. It's going to stitch a couple times here and then start back for the next layer. Every other stitch that you add in adds in bulk. It adds in bulletproof designs. It adds in a lot of density. So if you have a tiny line, let's rebuild this. Let's say I have a line like this. I have a line like this now. I've got 1 stitch wide to here. I've got a stitch and a stitch and a stitch. I have at least 7 stitches here to get back to start on the next one. If this line is only 3 millimeters wide, that's really, really dense. You're talking about putting a lot of extra stitches in. And it's not very stable. It's going to curl, it's going to wiggle, it's going to make a not really, really pretty line. So we really want to try in tatami to always have larger areas and not have small areas. In our other video, when we made pizza together, and that was good pizza, by the way, we talked about cutting out holes. Why do we not want to cut out holes in tatami? That's why we can't cut out holes in tatami. It doesn't have enough to keep it together. Even if you make the stitches shorter, you're asking the machine sometimes to make little tiny stitches like this. They're not always half of the brick. They might just be a little part like that. And it's simply not enough to hold this. Okay, so we can have large holes in tatami because the machine can calculate how to do large holes. But we really don't want little tiny lines cut out of a tatami design because it's just going to create a lot of extra stitches for you. The stitch count will be less if you have a large area of tatami and then use satin stitch on top. So what do we want to remember when we're doing tatami? We want it to be nice and sturdy. We want as few turnarounds as we can get. We don't want any cutouts that are long, thin lines. Large cutouts are okay. And remember that you can alter the length of your tatami stitch if you want, and that will sometimes help. And you can also use pattern tatami. But we always want to respect the tatami because it's a brick. Think of it as brick building a house and making something really sturdy. So if you have any other questions, you know you can always contact us at embroiderylegacy.com or in the 2 Facebook groups. So until we talk again, keep on building, people.